Thank you very much for coming. This is our very first Free Speech Union Speakeasy in the southwest of England, about time too, I think. So over 100 people signed up today to come, which is amazing. And we didn't know what would happen when we started advertising, whether anybody would want to come or whether they would make the trip or whatever. We'll find out more later where you've come from. So what we do with our regional events is try to spread ourselves around the country as much as possible. I know when we first started, we thought it was just a question of organising speakeasies in pubs. And actually, it's far easier to organise things if they're more organised than it is to organise something very informal. So what we've basically done is rolled out what we do in London around the country over the past year. So we've been to Edinburgh, Cardiff, Brighton, Oxford, Cambridge, Manchester, Birmingham, fairly regularly so far. In January, we're going to Belfast, back to Manchester, hoping to do something in Glasgow. And the idea really is to try to reach out to our over 12,000 members now, and create opportunities for people to get together, to hear from really excellent speakers, and to discuss the kinds of issues that we think people want to discuss and that they find important, and to meet each other. So in some of the places around the country, members have organised amongst themselves to meet up independently. And there are sort of independent groups. So we don't officially organise any local groups, but in some places there are people that are particularly keen to get something going. So in Brighton, there's a very lively debate group. I can't remember what they call them. I think they call themselves Brighton Free Speeches or something. But they meet every month and just organise debates amongst themselves in a pub. In Cardiff, there's another group, and they organise speaker events and various discussions. Where else? Cambridge, there's a group that meets regularly. They have really good speakers. They had Laura Dodsworth speaking for them last week. And then there's two independent meetups, at least in Manchester, who organise events by themselves, and we let other members know about those. So if there is anybody who's particularly keen to try and get something going in the Southwest, then do talk to me afterwards, and we can try and find a way of helping you to meet up with other members and put the word out. So the reason why we're so keen to get people together is that we know that there are a lot of people out there who are independent-minded and free-thinking, and for whom free speech is the most foundational value. It's the thing they care most about and the thing they're most concerned about. But people often feel very beleaguered if you're that person. And by getting people together, we hope that you can sort of feel slightly less beleaguered and actually start to see yourselves as something of a community. So I do hope that by the end of the evening, you feel that you're some way along the road to feeling that way. And that not only that, obviously, you've had a chance to hear from some really fantastic speakers who I'll introduce in a moment, and also to take part in a discussion. So we're going to have a very long, nicely, pleasantly long Q&A so that you can ask direct questions of the speakers and also express your opinions on what's been said. So I would also like to thank our volunteers, Kathy at the back, and Milia and Pekka, and the student volunteers who've come from the university to help out. Without you, it would have been very, very hairy indeed, because my assistant Vinay, who normally comes around the country and helps, is not available today. But I have got my colleague Ben Jones. Ben, do you want to stand up? He's very tall. So Ben is, I can never remember Ben's title, it's very long. Ben is Director of Case Operations and Outreach, but what that actually means is that he does two things that are really important. One is that he's absolutely immersed in cases. That's what he does all day, every day, is he's working on members' cases and trying to guide them through any attempts that have been made to restrict their free speech. And so he's fascinating to talk to, so do find him afterwards. And he also helps me and Vinay to run the MacTaggart programme, the Ian MacTaggart programme, which is a funding programme for students where we're trying to help students who do want to meet and discuss in an open way to support existing societies, to come up with new initiatives. And so at Exeter, I think there's 3 organisations that we're currently supporting. The Exeter Debating Society, which is a very long-standing society. the Speakeasy Society, which is brand new. Who's the Speakeasy people? Hands up. Okay. Oh, there's lots of you. Excellent. Anybody here from Debating Society then? Okay, very good. And then what's the name of the other one? Freedom Association. Anybody here from Freedom Association? No. Okay, but there are three societies up on Exeter that we're supporting at the moment, which is it's just a really very positive move, and around the country we're doing that, and then also supporting very kind of creative individual projects like somebody who wants to do some podcasting, interviewing young people who've made a difference through exercising their right to free speech. So that's the other part of Ben's role. We are recording this so that people who can't make it can watch it, and people from all around the country, obviously, and who are abroad can also watch it when it goes up on a YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find most of our events, I think, are up there now. So you can always keep up to date with those events. And I also wanted to thank the venue for just making it very easy to organise this event. It's not a given that venues will host us, and it's really nice when they do, and they make it very easy. So I'd like to thank the staff here as well, and the bookseller. So just to say that there is Nigel is selling Doug Stokes' book all evening. So at the end you can get a copy, and Doug will sign that for you. Okay, right, so on to our speakers, the meat of the evening. So we're really delighted to welcome two speakers, both of whom have been very important allies and advisors to the Free Speech Union from the very outset 3.5 years ago when Toby Young set it up. We have Professor Doug Stokes, who's the director of the Strategy and Security Institute at the University of Exeter. He's also a fellow at the Legatum Institute and a member of the Free Speech Union's Advisory Council. His writings appear in The Times, The Telegraph, The Critic and The Spectator. You've probably read something by Doug if you haven't read his book already. And this event has been inspired by Doug's latest book, Against Decolonisation, Campus, Culture Wars and the Decline of the West. I think we get a strong sense there where Doug's coming from on this particular question. And then we also have Dr. Alka Sehgal Cuthbert, who has over 20 years' experience in education, teaching, researching and advising. And she's got a particular interest in the question of what and how we should be teaching young people. So her PhD was in the theories of knowledge and how we should be teaching, what we should be teaching young people to kind of take forward the gains of civilization. She's also the founder and director of Don't Divide Us, which some of you may have heard of. A campaign set up in the summer of 2020 at a time of heightened racial divisions, or apparent heightened racial divisions, to challenge what Don't Divide Us see as a dangerous slide towards divisive racialised thinking. So I'm sure you'll agree that both of them are very well equipped to discuss what we're down to discuss tonight, which is decolonisation, freeing our minds, or dangerous groupthink. What we'll do is we'll have a kind of conversation between ourselves for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll come out to you. So there'll be plenty of time for questions and comments from you, and we'll wrap up by about 8:30. Can I just ask for a show of hands from the audience, who, besides the title of tonight's event, who'd heard of decolonisation as a concept? Okay, interesting. And who thinks that they could explain it to their grandmother, child or grandchild? Okay, by the end of the night we'll fix that. We'll fix that for you. Oh, that's so good, thank you. Right. Sorry, I should also say that the audience isn't on camera, but the speakers are. So that's the way we normally do things. So the first thing I wanted to ask Doug is, what is decolonisation, and why should we be worried about it?
Well, thank you very much. I'm on the tail end of COVID, so I'm not feeling 100%, but I'm here. So that's the most important thing. What is decolonisation? Decolonisation ultimately refers to the formal process of the end of the European empires. And so on that sense, it's the political dissolution of the European empires. But I think why we're here today is mainly what decolonisation has become, which is a kind of ideology that's rampant across the university system and seeks to sort of ultimately deconstruct the West or Western civilization. It's a critique of Western civilization ultimately. and it's a philosophical critique as well. And my big motivation for writing the book was really the way in which these ideas were imposed as a new orthodoxy on academic life, and seeking to ultimately to deconstruct and to control what's taught and what's thought. So I'll give you an example. My own institution, Exeter University, still on its books has a stipulation for the humanities and social science faculty that any new course or changes to old courses has to show how it's moving away from a white Eurocentric curriculum. So the problem with that is that where I'm coming from on this is that, I mean, we're introducing highly racialized concepts to academic life and to British life in general. And a lot of this has been imported from America and from America's own racial discourse. And I think it's doing a great disservice to British culture, British life. And I think it's highly liberal and dangerous and highly divisive for race relations as well in this country. So decolonising really refers to the in the formal sense, the political dissolution of the European empires across the global south. That's one thing. I'm not critiquing that. You know, that we can historical debates. Not talking about that. But I'm talking about decolonising as an ideology, and in particular, the executive imposition of decolonising ideology by university executives. But we also see this as a broader cultural ideology across British institutions, the BBC, and major cultural institutions. And so essentially, what it argues is Western civilization is fundamentally malign. And it's a kind of racialized concept of white privilege, and you ultimately have to deconstruct. It says basically that what's happened is because of European imperialism in the global south, what's now happened is the ideology that justified that is still around. It's still around in our society, and ultimately we have to expunge that ideology. We have to sort of cleanse ourselves of this ideology, and this ideology is pervasive within our institutions as well, and it sets up allegedly disparate outcomes for ethnic minorities and other minoritized groups. And so it's a kind of a holy mission to sort of expunge and to deconstruct this and these alleged differential outcomes. When you look at the data on it, it's complete nonsense, absolute nonsense. Basically, I mean, you look at anybody can go through the Office of National Statistics, for example, and look at some of the best educational outcomes. East Asians and Indians in this country. Some of the best financial outcomes, again, East Asians and Indians. So basically, what it does, what it ultimately says is that there's a legacy ideological effect from European imperialism that's still pervasive across British institutions. We have to expunge this kind of ideology. And we're doing this from a moral position. And so the main thing is that's the kind of broad sweep of it.
Okay. Alka, does that match your own view of it?
Yes, it does. I suppose I would go, perhaps put one of the points that Doug made a little bit, perhaps take it a little bit further in that I don't think decolonisation, let's just call anti-colonialism the political and economic struggles for freedom. That was then. That's not what we're talking about. Totally agree with that. Decolonisation, I think, is... I think it's not just a legacy. I think what this kind of loosely related set of beliefs is doing, it's really a way of justifying us ditching every single major achievement that makes up our society today. So I'd agree with that. So things like the rule of law, a belief in scientific objectivity. And when I say scientific objectivity, I don't just mean scientists in white coats. I mean scientific in a broad sense of systematic knowledge. So it can include the humanities and also the arts as well. But it's knowledge that is different to everyday knowledge. And through that knowledge, you can approximate objectivity, although we'll never get to be totally objective because then we'd be God and then everything would be over anyway. So it's not that. But so these were the kinds of lodestars by which thinkers and political people and ordinary people throughout history have tried to understand their world, see what problems there were and how to improve it, and have indeed made progress. So, sorry, I've got to remind myself. Rule of law, the nation state as well is another very specific target of decolonisation. I think the key text on this will probably be Marcuse's repressive tolerance. But it's this, this idea that the nation state was, Marcuse acknowledges rather grudgingly that there was a need for it, hundreds of years ago, to protect religious freedom. But now we've got that. That's all over with. We've got that. Now we don't need it. So now we can go for positive repressive tolerance, which is kind of a form of positive affirmation or positive discrimination. And it's not what they're saying, decolonising today, isn't just that this is a legacy. They're saying that all these achievements are rooted in colonialism and racism, right? It's not just a legacy. We would not have these achievements if we had not had colonialism and racism. And the way if we value it today, if we value tolerance, if we value, say, for example, understanding the difference between children and adults, because our knowledge of psychology and human development has emerged through knowledge, if we value the rule of law, if we value being kind as a general principle of behaving to other people as equals, then if we really want to do that, this is where the twist comes in, then we have to give it all up. Then we have to disavow it. We have to devalue it. We have to devalue it because its very existence is a testament to colonialism and racism. That is literally what all this is based upon, an assertion. And they feel no need, there is no way of substantiating this because it's not an empirical theory, isn't based in reality, it's based in a theoretical speculation. And everything is built on top of that. It's this edifice on quicksand, I think.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah, can you, when you do that, sure. Why race? Why is race the thing that is central to this?
Well, I mean, I think race is part of a broader sort of spectrum of this politics of vulnerability, which we can come on to in a second, basically. And I think this also relates to elements of progressive politics that we've seen develop, especially in the last 20-odd years. But in the book, I kind of unpack some of those deeper philosophical issues. I didn't want to necessarily unpack that here, but I can do that if you wanted to. But essentially, a lot of decolonising comes from the decolonising theories. When we see a lot of this stuff in British politics or Anglophone politics in general, you have to understand this rests on deeper philosophical and theoretical edifices. And you have to understand those presuppositions to understand what's happening at the surface level in our culture. So essentially, what you had in social scientific theory on the university campuses the last 20 or 30 years, what happens there then escapes the petri dish of the university campus and then tends to spread into the broader institutions and our culture in general. But go back to what Alka was talking about, what you basically had was you had social constructivism. And social constructivism kind of draws from postmodern and post-structural philosophy, argues that there's no such thing as reality, science, or objectivity or truth. It draws on kind of thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, and then in the post-colonial tradition, sort of decolonising, a guy called Edward Said, and they basically argue that there's no such thing as truth. In fact, even to assert truth is just to assert your own dominance over me. So social life then becomes a set of sort of siloed truths where we all struggle over. Life is an endless struggle. So by you talking about truth and science, that's rubbish. What you're doing is you're imposing your truth onto me. And then when you marry that up to a narrative of vulnerability, and these technocratic progressive elites are going to save these endlessly vulnerable and at-risk populations from this terrible process of colonialism, right? Then what you begin to do is you begin to breathe life into sort of institutional. You give institutions moral directionality. It's a kind of, in my opinion, when I argue in the book, it's a kind of technocratic power play beyond left and right. By the way, it's a technocratic power play, and we see that very, very strongly. It's basically technocratic, professional managerial elites essentially play a politics of vulnerability. There's the COVID, we have to save you from COVID. There's racism, we have to save you from racism. There's sexism, we have to save you from... And what does it basically mean? Endlessly, time and time again, you give us power. We define the problem, and therefore once we define risk, we have the institutional power to save you from that risk. It's a power play, basically.
But, so, I mean, my experience... prior to working for the Free Speech Union, I worked in academia for 15, 20 years. And the first time I was aware of this wasn't from fellow academics. It was actually from bureaucrats. It really was from bureaucrats.
That it comes exactly. I mean, I kind of, if you're interested in some of the literature on this, is like the sort of Michael Lynn's work's fantastic. Christopher Lash's work is fantastic too, and they talk about that. They sort of root that out originally in the Cold War. And they talk about sort of capitalism versus communism, but they say basically the people that won those struggles are the bureaucrats, and you really see this now. It's kind of we have this kind of a deep administrative state, basically centres of concentrated power that are ultimately one step removed from democratic accountability, and you have basically bureaucratic and technocratic elites that use, in my opinion, what I argue for the book, and others argue, Michael Lynn and Christopher Lash, etc., a politics of risk and vulnerability, endlessly vulnerable populations, right, which then they get to define and ultimately to use their institutional power to save. It's a kind of saviour script, and maybe later on we can come on to the sort of the deeper theology of this. A lot of this is also, I think, related to a kind of deeper theology, a sort of secular, post-Protestant, secular kind of ideology.
Yeah, I'd just like to say a little bit more about how it's spread within academia. Just to say, I did my PhD that Jan told you about on knowledge and, well, epistemology and values and liberal education at Cambridge. And I consider myself very lucky to have got there in probably the last year where someone like me could study the subject that I did with the kind of freedom that I had with an academic who unfortunately has since passed away. But in a conversation with him, he made the remark that when he first started at Cambridge, he was a working class lad from South London, worked his way up through many mediocre institutions before getting a job at Cambridge. And he said, we all used to, when I first started at Cambridge, we all, generally lecturers looked the same. They looked pretty similar, but there was such different ideas. And people identified themselves as academics according to their disciplines. They were like a kind of fellowship, a community of scholars, and there would be rivalries and no doubt kind of nefarious deeds and all kinds of jealousies and rivalries. But generally they were contained within disciplinary standards and rules and procedures that was actually very fruitful for sifting out knowledge claims and making better knowledge. He said, but now, we look around and all the academics look so different. You have purple hair, green hair, you have this colour, that colour, you have a whole plethora of demographic diversity, but everybody thinks the same. And when Doug said that they won the struggle, I think I would disagree slightly because I think there was never a struggle. Because I think what happened was the bureaucrats walked in at an open door, because for years what had been happening within academia was that the people who should have been defending standards of truth, who should have been calling out shoddy scholarship, who should have been demanding better logical reasoning or better empirical evidence for claims that people were making, didn't do so, or not enough of them did. And that eventually led to that wasn't just like an intellectual problem, that actually eroded the kind of community relations amongst scholars. And it opened the door to, first of all, very managerialist, technocratic ways of organising academia. That was in the wake of the educational reforms of the late 80s and early 90s in higher education. We saw the introduction of faux markets into education, and where students and pupils become seen as more as consumers with choice rather than potential members of citizens of a public, being introduced to important, almost sacred forms of public knowledge. That kind of got more and more swept away from the public table, and that left a vacuum. And you need something to control, you need something to create order. So if it's not going to be the standards and procedures and principles of behaviour and conduct that are generated internally from within disciplines, then it's going to come from outside. And it did. It came from the rise of the bureaucrats, the rise of the managerialists. And that might have created order for a short while. but it's very thin resources ethically. Nobody gets up in the morning feeling excited about going to teach, in order to fulfill some new target that somebody somewhere's implemented. So it left an ethical and moral vacuum. And the discourse of decolonisation is, as Doug said, nothing if not hyper-moralised. And I think that's one reason why it has some traction amongst sections of academia.
I didn't really grab it off you. It does seem to have got a grip very quickly, though, and a lot of those things seem to have been in place already. So when I was teaching, 2001 onwards, I can really remember the shift from it being okay just to consider every student as being pretty much the same as another one. So when you just marked their essays as if they were any person. And then over time, the early 2000s, each essay, suddenly people were starting to have educational needs statements. So when you were marking, you had to consider whether they had dyslexia, whether they had numerous other conditions or special needs of some kind. I'm not rubbishing those, but it was noticeable that they weren't there and then they were. And then it became other kinds of highly individualised ways in which you had to relate to the student, whether because they would tell you that they'd had an abortion or that their granny had died or that they'd, and you were having to deal with them in highly kind of personal ways that crossed boundaries. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the sort of monitoring of ethnicity, which wasn't a factor when I first started teaching because there were very few black students at the University of Kent. And then during that time, we have a much more diverse population, massively expanded, lots of students coming from London, for example, from South London or from overseas. And suddenly the population the university seemed to be managing the student population really differently. So again, why race? That's the thing because gender doesn't seem to quite do this. So why race?
I think the race element really came in after the sort of George Floyd. I think that that was a weird period. We had the pandemic, and then we had the George Floyd, and then a lot of the kind of, I guess what maybe you could argue would be the slightly more toxic racial politics of America was really brought in. And you see a lot of this now, the sort of invocation of American sort of racial ideology in this country. To the extent we're talking about, I think Kent, in fact, has got its own indigenous knowledge centre there or something like that. What are they talking about? I don't know, the Anglo-Saxons? I don't know, maybe. I've got no idea. The Sheppey, yeah, okay, we'll stick with that. So the George Floyd thing really came on steroids, and then the kind of the alleged neo-racist ideology that we saw coming out of America was really imported into British universities. But then you also have there's a kind of what I call the grievance industrial complex, where you've got activist charities or NGOs given loads of taxpayers' money, by the way, by the Tories. To sort of accredit universities on the kind of a social justice scale. Stonewall was the most obvious one, right? But we've also got Advance HE that runs what's called the Race Equality Charter. So how do you get your brownie points? This kind of very weird notion of diversity. So essentially, you've got to sort of monitor endlessly, sort of ethnic monitoring of staff numbers, student numbers. But when you look at the data again, it's like, and on a per I won't get into the data on it, but on a per capita basis, there's a massive over-representation of ethnic minority staff in the UK. Not a problem; it's a great thing, but So it's very odd. But then it's also kind of white privilege ideology, and then decolonising. So essentially, the race equality chart that's run by Advance HE, which is the Stonewall equivalent in the race thing, they accredit universities. So they go along, and you can get bronze stars or silver stars. There's no gold star. because you never arrive at the sort of post-racial utopia, I presume. But basically, so universities, and again going back to Alka's point about consumerism, so universities submit themselves to what's called the Race Equality Charter. Have you decolonised your curriculum? Have you got diversity, blah 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 blah, white privilege, structural racism, da 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 da, right? And then you go on university campus, the most progressive. I mean, is as if they're kind of like neo-Nazi factories producing kind of white supremacists. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? But anyway, so Advanced HE run this Race Equality Charter. So essentially, Exeter's got a bronze star and somebody's got a silver star somewhere. And so it's the way Stonewall was operated. So you get these very powerful lawfare type charities who come along and they say, well, have you got, it's like, like the mafia, they knock on and then they go into a restaurant. This is a nice restaurant. You make nice pizzas. It'd be a shame if somebody damaged your window. Yeah? Give us a bit of money. That's what they do. So they go along to the university. Have you got your, do you want to be part of a Race Equality Charter? Who's going to say no to that? Oh, because you're you're racist, are you? Oh, she's a racist. So you've got to then fill out this massive forms and send them off, and then they assess you. Have you decolonised? If you move away from a white Eurocentric curriculum, you get a bronze star. Next year, you might get a silver star if you go a bit further down the line. Oh, this year you've been a naughty boy, you're only going to get a bronze star. That's exactly how it works. That's how Stonewall operate, by the way. Yeah? So essentially, you've got these university executives who are caught between a rock and a hard place, to be fair to them. You've got activist students. Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? Then you've got these charities. Have you got your bronze star yet? And then they want to keep the consumers happy. And then you've got a broader ideology and a collapse of moral authority across this country. A collapse of moral authority. And most of this could have been done. You draw a line. Don't cross that line. They don't do that. They collapse into it. They give up. No, and nobody's got any courage anymore. That's another thing as well. I don't want to rant too much. Nobody's got any courage anymore. So 2 + 2 + 2 = 6.
I'm not going to add any more to that vivid picture. I'm trying to sort of envisage these wimpy bureaucrats along with like Marlon Brando or something from The Godfather, and imagining. I think I'd just like to bring in something a bit different about race to the description of today that Doug's given so well, which is that one part of their argument is that racism is this sort of timeless category, that it goes right back to the beginning. You've always had racism, and they'll refer to bits of books written by everyone and anyone in the past and pick up a bit of vocabulary and say, there you go, that's racism. But I think it's really worth remembering that we should take history and historical specificity seriously, because race has not always been what it means today. If you go back to the early days of trading, mercantile capitalism, that's the 16th century, Doug, I think, yeah. You'll see the kind of writings that were done then by thinkers, writers, explorers that would hop on the trade ships and go off to distant lands, write, come back with their new knowledge and new insights and bits of different items and artifacts. They would talk about race, and sometimes the language would be quite derogatory, but not always. Because what they were grappling with being part of a new type of society, the very early days of modern society, where societies in what we now call Europe, it wasn't really known Europe as widely as Europe then, where nations were having, gone through religious wars and finally having settled them in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, I think. They were developing states. They were developing new forms of governance. And their encounters with people outside of from different societies was a form of self-critique more than anything else. It was a way of trying to understand their own societies. So Montaigne, Is that how you say it?
Go for it.
Anyway, however you say it, Montaigne, for example, he was writing that, he talked about the primitives or the savages I think in Southern America, but he said they were morally superior to Europeans. Now, he wasn't self-flagellating, he was just saying they were morally superior because they didn't kill in the way that Western countries in Europe had killed during the wars. But politically, European countries were superior because they had state institutions, they had forms of government. So race then, the discussions on race then was very, very different. Now, by the time you move forward a few centuries to when these newly emerging countries were now mature, industrialised countries, and the cracks were beginning to show, the limits and contradictions were beginning to show by the time you get to the mid to late 19th century. And that's when race takes on it kind of shifts to a different level of meaning. And it becomes much more, not a way of self-critiquing, but a way of justifying the inequalities inherent within the system. So, we thought we were promising freedom and equality for everybody, but clearly in Victorian England, right, not everybody was equal, aka, Dickens and Condition of the Working Class, Engels, Condition of the Working Class. It was very clear that those promises were not being met. And race then became a justification for those inadequacies. And so that it became, it was an elite ideology then, a justificatory ideology, that unfortunately for the ruling classes after the Second World War became a bit more problematic. They couldn't use race in that same way anymore. And you have institutions like UNESCO basically decreeing that race was no longer a category that could be respectably used by anyone. There was no longer any agreement about it. And that was okay, because at that point, after the Second World War, our powers that be found other ways of ruling. That was the era of social democracy. It was the era of social citizenship. It was the era of the working classes becoming more organised and being able to articulate their own interests and a distinct vision of society that could hold a check on the exertion of the powers that be. And so you had this kind of balance, in the post-war period. And that was underpinned by all sorts of things. I'm sure Doug will know more about, the Cold War being one of them. Economic growth underpinned by America, I think, mainly. But that's gone. Those prerequisites have gone now. And at this point, we can now see race coming back in the guise of anti-racism. But this is the new form of racism. This is legitimising, literally legitimising the crudest form of racism. I was talking with on a panel with a teacher educator at the Institute of Education in London, and she was boasting very proudly of making her class feel proud of their black hair and their black skin. And it reminded me of those biological zoos from the late 19th century. But this is where we're at with the elites.
Okay, but then what? So then, what is race now? Then it is a moral category. So why is it that the old political or ideological kind of concepts or categories have become so morally charged? So, talking about the oppressed and the oppressor was a kind of analytical thing and a political way of talking in the past, whereas now it's a kind of hammer, isn't it? It's a very, very blunt tool for trying to divide the world into good and evil. You're oppressed or you're an oppressor. You're colonised or a coloniser. You're black or you're white. So why such simple? We're always told that we're moving into a very binary world that's kind of, people blame social media and all that kind of stuff, but this isn't social media, is it? This is a deep kind of binary way of looking at the world, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's also a very dangerous way of looking at the world, because it's mainly a kind of progressive or a kind of elite, cultural elite guilt trip. Very anti-democratic. Most people don't buy it. I just think it's rubbish. Look at the BBC, blah, blah, blah. And it's a guilt trip, and it works on the campus because everybody's nice and bourgeois and polite. But outside, what's it doing to race relations outside of the campus or those safe spaces? I think either way I see it is a really dangerous kind of race war rhetoric indulged by white liberals, liberal elites. But we're entering into a very sort of strange period. Again, the book touches on this. I mean, if you think about where we are in European history, we're kind of still dining out on the post-war institutional settlement as a result of the Second World War, the Bretton Woods, American hegemony. But that's all in decline. We're entering into a more multipolar international system. The peace that we've enjoyed in Europe is coming under great strain, as we're seeing in Ukraine with Russia. Germany's all in a little tiz with its energy, and it can't pull its finger out vis-a-vis its own security. America's now potentially, it's got to fight in Ukraine, it's got to supply Ukraine, it's got to support Israel and the Middle East, it's got to potentially fight in Taiwan. And then we have economic dislocations as well. So in many ways, where the West is heading, where Europe's heading, we've got a return of great power competition in Europe. American hegemony, this is the irony of it. A lot of this progressive nonsense really rests on American hegemony and American empire, because the globalization period really underpinned a lot of that stuff. You can be secure, right? But we are entering into a period of great power competition. And a more multipolar international system. So a lot of this stuff, in my opinion, is very much a sort of dangerous ideological dalliance.
But wouldn't you think, if that was the case, wouldn't you think that those multipolarities would be reflected in our thinking, whereas it looks like it's going the other way, where we've got these very simple binaries, even more so than in the Cold War?
I think where we're at in terms of elite cultural institutions is way out of whack where the British public is, and I think going down the track in the next 5-10 years, it's going to get interesting in Western politics in general. I think the benign period that we've had is kind of washing away a bit, and I think in many ways what we've seen has been an absolute betrayal of the trust and the goodwill of the British people in this country. I think that where we're going, I hate to be a harbinger of doom. Maybe it's the COVID. It's put me in a bad mood. It has put me in a bad mood. Yeah, but I'd hate to be a harbinger of doom. But I think what we had, really goodwill. I mean, where would you rather be as a sexual minority, an ethnic minority, than in this country? Right? Is it perfect? Of course, it's not. But it's don't let the perfect be or the good be the enemy of the perfect, or the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? And if we think about human history, it's you have the great powers come and go, the Roman Empire, the Greeks and the Zulus, you name it, right? And so history hasn't stopped. The end of history is rubbish. History will carry on, and so where are we going to be in 100 years' time? Will it be a Western system of multicultural liberal democracies? Or will it be something very different, a more of a sinocentric system? What will that look like? Do you think they're going to, do you see what I mean? So what I'm saying is this. We are entering into an interesting period in Western politics. I think where we'll be in 10 years' time is very different to where we've been. And I think that what we've seen in our cultural institutions over the last 3 or 4 years has done incredible damage to the goodwill of the British people. And I think the chickens are going to come home to roost. And I say that with great sorrow.
Okay, so it's before we come out to the room, and I'm aware that, we haven't got two sides of this debate, so I'm kind of reliant on the room to ask all the difficult questions. But I wanted to just come on to the question of, you raised a kind of anti-democratic kernel or tendency to all of this. And I suppose, to me, that then immediately raises alarm bells about free speech as a kind of basic principle of democracy. But why do you think it is that free speech is under threat from decolonisation? It's not obvious necessarily what the relationship is between those things.
Well, there's a macro and the micro. The micro level, basically, just again stick with Exeter. So here you have a Russell Unit institution, and on the whole, it's a great institution. It's great. It's great. If you're a student here, it's a wonderful campus. I'm not, but I'm a member of the HAS faculty. I'm looking out. I see a few others in the audience here too. If I want to teach a new course, say I want to do a new course on, I don't know, the thought of Aristotle. On the form that I have to fill out, it's not a directive, but it kindly suggests, you need to show how you're moving away from a white Eurocentric curriculum. Now, the idea, and I'm from Hackney, the most multiracial part of Europe back in the day, right? The idea that on a university campus, they would signal that there's a problem with whiteness and European thought is disgusting. And the fact that they could leave it on there, it was covered in the Daily Telegraph in 2021, 2022, 2 stories, it's still there. So I just think that the way I see it is a lot of this race war, neo-racism that we see in our institutions, it's like it's like kids playing with matches on top of a tinderbox. We've got a rising China, we've got an increasingly strong Russia, we've got a doolally European continent where the Germans can't work out what they want, where the French, blah, blah, blah. I can go into geopolitics if you want, right? We've got a declining America with Joe Biden, great, and then Trump, okay, whatever, right? So, if America goes down the tubes, right, what's going to hold up the Western-led liberal international order, which, by the way, is the most progressive international system you're ever really going to get in the Anglophone world, at least, right? These progressives are calling for, Hamas, and they want to deconstruct and overthrow the institutional order. What's going to wait for you down the line? Who's going to pick up, the Chinese? They're going to liberate you. Hamas are going to liberate you. Do you see what I mean? So you're caught. It's like chickens. It's like turkeys calling for Christmas. It's very odd, and it's very much kind of symptomatic of the politics of the noughties and the post-Cold War period. But I don't think they quite realise that the sun is setting on the American empire, and there are changes afoot.
I just want to say, just draw out a little bit more of the anti-democratic thing, and it links to why race. It's a very simple reason, I think, which is that we've got racial minorities in Britain. We haven't got sex. It isn't a minority. It's kind of 50-50. And what we're seeing is the politicisation of ethnic minorities, the weaponization of people like me in order to basically beat people like you, because you're all white, to stigmatise, to put you on your back foot, to make you feel like you can't really speak openly because you can't possibly know what it's like to have lived in my shoes as a brown-skinned woman, which is a really very stupid thing because no other individual can know what it's like. Can't know what it's like to, live like Nina Simone lived, or like any other, living black woman might live. We are individuals, and this ideology denies that and puts us in groups. And then it's morally affirming, giving a lot of moral status to particular groups in order to create a new consensus, a new holding, a new way for the new powers, the professional managerial classes, if you like. But that this new order is history doesn't just always move in a linear way upwards and onwards. We can go backwards, and we're going backwards in terms of going back from the democratic order we had before.
And also, the other element of this, I see the culture war very much as a class war, and I see a lot of this stuff very much like a class war. The idea that you can lump all white people in this, like we all sat around on the beach sipping pina coladas and like having people running around like our servants, it's absolute rubbish. In 1830, when slavery was finally, thankfully, got rid of across the colonies, the average age of death for an ordinary Brit was about 30 to 40 years old. 16-hour days down the pits. The vast majority of British white people, right, lived lives of nasty, brutish and short, desperate poverty, land clearances, mass slums, the Victorian workhouses. You can go on and on and on and on. So again, I think there's a real sense of injustice about this and a sense of anger when you turn on the BBC and you have privileged white people, but also often ethnic minorities drawn from extraordinarily privileged families across the globe, the Brahmin class, etc., from India, lecturing people and putting out a general race war rhetoric that all white people are privileged and stuff like that. I mean, like Kahindi Andrews, there's like this kind of done this new book on, I can't remember the name of it, it's The Psychosis of Whiteness. Why doesn't Kahindi Andrews leave his secure professorial chair, his nice fat USS pension, go up to Hull, go up to a council estate in Hull, put your money where your mouth is. Go up there and tell the people in that council estate about the psychosis of their whiteness. So, in other words, often there's an elision between class and race in a lot of this progressive discourse and ideology, where, and I think that's what makes people the most angry. They feel that they're being guilt-tripped and sold a false history.
Well, there is something a bit weird about the weakness of the ideologues. I mean, if all we've got is Kahindi Andrews and Dr. Scholler, you do kind of think, well, really,
Dr. Scholler, by the way, she's often on the TV. I can't remember her first name. She's from Nigerian royalty. And there's another thing. This fake history, as if like pre-colonial Africa was one Garden of Eden. It was characterised by, again, I go into in the book, the tribal warfare, mass intra-African slavery. I'm not saying her personally, but if you're from Nigerian royalty, the kingdom of Dahomey, you can go on and on, right? More than likely, somebody somewhere in your family owned slaves.
Okay. Right. I'm going to come out and with my microphone, which is on a cable, which is why I'm going to come with it, Oprah Winfrey style, old school Oprah Winfrey.
Good evening. Very interested in what you had to say, and I felt, God, I want to say something here, so I shall. What interested me really was when you started, you spoke about, let's say, the deconstruction of society and philosophy, which actually underpins the moral basis upon which we all live and need to live by. And so what it's become, in a sense, is almost like a mist. And within that, the Derrida stuff about the individual and all of that, which I personally feel is total bloody nonsense, but what it does do, it makes everybody vulnerable and isolated within a structureless world. Now, to me, what that means is that once people start getting together, because they need security, and we've needed that since we lived in caves, yeah? People start to form tribes, whether they're based on race, colour, where you live, your football team, whoever it might be, you need that kind of moral support to be able to live your life. And what worries me, and you've raised this here, is that we possibly are going into a situation where there are so many subdivisions, society has fallen apart, and therefore we have great, let's say, potential for conflict. What can free speech under those circumstances do to bind people back together in a meaningful, structural way without necessarily bringing religion in and getting rid of those bloody bureaucrats?
Thank you. I might just take a couple more. Has anybody got any... Okay, has anybody got... Before... I should have said this. Anybody got any direct, brief questions to start with before we come to the long contribution? Is it a question? Because otherwise we can... We'll come... You've got to... Right, okay, do that. I always mean to do this and I forget.
I did American and Commonwealth Arts at Exeter as a mature student, 1985. There wasn't any suggestion from anyone at that time that we were white European-centric. The exception to that would be the stuff we studied about the United States because they had a revolution against us, and that was pretty important for them. So there certainly wasn't any suggestion that we wouldn't talk about that. A lot of the writers and movie makers we looked at were people from indigenous backgrounds, didn't speak English as a first language, from the Commonwealth, so from that background. What I'm interested in, so for me, Exeter is brilliant, and I learned a lot of great skills, and I don't necessarily recognise that's not happening now. What worries me is what you said at the beginning, and you've just repeated it, which is about this idea that you have to prove a particular agenda when you're designing a course. I wonder if you just explain what might that look like? What is someone asking you to actually write down? How will you evidence that? And what might happen to your tenure if you don't? Forgive me, that's not... The explanation wasn't short.
Yeah, but there was a question at the end of it, so that's good. Any even shorter questions? Actually, genuinely short questions. Is it? Short question. Okay, go.
Has the academy, has the university are there too many students? And is it starting to dominate in a way that it was never ever intended to?
Very good. Do you want to share that, Mike?
Just on that question there, I think that's a really great question, because the expansion of higher education has always been received as if it were an unqualified, unmitigated good, and it was done for the benefit of everyone. Very much under that kind of old immediate post-war idea of expansion of education. Education is a right, first of all, for returning soldiers, and then for increasing sections of the public. But and again, I think back to my wonderful lecturer at who I did my PhD with. He said, you know, in one of his papers, he notes a sociological truth is that every time you have a qualitative, some substantial change in the cohort of people in education, there will be a change in the curriculum, some sort of controversy. And you had it, first of all, when they raised the leaving age to incorporate more working class pupils. Then the discussion was all about, well, would a grammar school curriculum be suitable for working class students in comprehensive or secondary moderns? And you had a discussion then about questioning knowledge. But you still had enough belief and enough people educated enough for that to tide over. But that's got weaker and weaker. And increasingly, I think at some point, I'm not sure where, at which point exactly, but there was a tipping point where if you like, the sociological function of higher education is no longer the pursuit of truthful knowledge. It is to inculcate, it's far more of the socialising aspect of it. And its socialisation today means socialisation into this elite equity, diversity and inclusion agenda, which is the polar opposite of the pursuit of truth or opening your mind.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess to answer the questions, try and wrap them up, sort of try and move across them all. My motivation for writing the book was because a lot of this stuff about that essentially characterises the campus as some sort of, as I said, some sort of almost like a Nazi white supremacist factory is so out of whack. It's like a mass gaslight of people, really. I mean, and my main thing also was the illiberalism and the anti-truth nature of a lot of this stuff. So I'll give you some examples. There was the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Council, did these reports in 2019, and these really formed the evidential basis of a lot of the EDI, decolonising agenda we see in universities. And you look at the data, it was done by a master's student from Nottingham, and I won't go into the methodology and all the rest of it. It was absolute, well, can't swear, but it wasn't very good, right? So you had that, right? But then how they kind of characterise it? How did they sustain this narrative? You look at the data. basically the incidence of racism on campuses, when you look at the actual data that the reports themselves use, are statistically insignificant. It was something like 0.1% across the entire. It was, and even, but the main way they sustained this narrative of like racism across British campuses was the concept of microaggressions. Anybody ever heard of microaggression? Yeah. This is kind of a totalitarian concept. So let me give you some examples of microaggressions that the EHRC actually used in their reports, and that were used as the evidential basis to push through the EDI agenda. You ready? Discussions of Brexit on campus have introduced a cold wind. That was evidence for microaggression. There was a black student in a lift on some campus somewhere, and a white student went to get into the lift and changed their mind, went and used the stairs instead. The black student felt that was because of innate racism. This is one that really gets me. The lecturer's body language and demeanour can be indicative of a racial microaggression. There was the VC at Cambridge. His name was Stephen Toop. Anybody heard of Stephen Toop? So he did this kind of online anonymous portal where academics and students can grass up other academics and students that might be committing evidences of racial microaggressions. Let me give you an example of a racial microaggression. A raised eyebrow. A raised eyebrow. So this is how totalitarian this stuff has become. A lecturer's body language or demeanour, a raised eyebrow, using the stairs instead of a lift. It's all evidence of racism on British campuses. So we've got to bring in advanced HE to give those the Bronze Star and the Silver Star to eliminate Brexit discussions and lift users and stair users and people that might raise their eyebrows as they talk to you. That's where it's at. And so I look at this stuff and I think to myself, this is infantile bullshit. It's absolute rubbish. Absolute rubbish. I feel it's patronising staff, and it's also patronising students. Most of my students, my PhD students, a lot of them come from Nigeria and all over the world. I talk to them about this stuff, they can't believe it. They think it's absolute patronising nonsense that infantilises ethnic minority students. It treats them like children. They have to be protected by these, invariably the white liberal bureaucrats. It's absolutely astonishing. So my big motivation really was a sense of injustice about this. I think that, broadly speaking, our university campus and universities are fantastic. There are obvious problems, consumerization and maybe etc. But broadly speaking, very progressive, really important. And so we have to defend intellectual diversity, pluralism, and the radical pursuit of truth. And then, but when we introduce these bureaucratic, authoritarian ideas of raised eyebrows, we've gone somewhere. We've almost become like the Soviet Union. We've gone badly, badly wrong.
It's an argument for Botox, isn't it, actually?
Compulsory.
Hang on, Alka. I'm going to come back out to the floor because we do need to whiz through so we can people get to the bar. Okay.
Hello, I'm one of those people who've used the world through data and statistics. So when you're looking at the evolution of the cultural elite bureaucrats over the last decade or so, it's easy to see what they've done with sex and gender and the trans movement. Notably, our National Statistics Office being taken to judicial review because it didn't know what sex was when it asked us in the census 2 years ago. I just wondered, is there data that we can see this decolonialisation through? I'm not really aware of it, but maybe there is.
Thank you. Right. Is it short? Okay.
There was an article in the BBC a couple of weeks ago that suggested that black women were disproportionately likely to be victims of bubonic plague in 14th century London. How deleterious is that recasting of history, that decolonising of history, to the goodwill that exists in Britain and the utterly widespread, non-controversial racial tolerance that we enjoy?
Thanks, Ben. Yes.
I have a question about, because I feel like there's a slight elephant in the room, maybe, and I might be wrong about this, but is it like I've been to university in the UK in many different places, and I've never seen a white supremacist or a outspoken Nazi, but I've interacted with multiple communists, and the left or the extreme socialism hasn't been mentioned. I appreciate that you have mentioned China and the Soviet Union. But I feel, and Herbert Marcuse, is there like any authors within this philosophy of decolonization who approach it from the right, or is it just simply a leftist problem?
Interesting question.
All I wanted to say is that I heard it said somebody was being interviewed on the radio a few months ago, and I will say they were black because I don't know where they were from, and you're not supposed to ask, but they were of colour, and they said, how bloody patronising, we can fight our own battles. We don't need other people to protect us from racism.
Thank you.
Isn't it very convenient if rough times are coming, that we are here busy fighting who is more hurt and what category of people are more oppressed? Because surely the Russians, the Chinese Communist Party, and Iran aren't doing that.
Thank you. Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. My son went to Exeter University, International Relations and Politics. He had to be very careful what he said. He's now at Johns Hopkins in Italy, and he's been attacked. This is the consequences of what's going on. He gets screamed at regularly when he's just socialising. It's called a white pig and just screamed at by other international students. Now, we used to be thought of very well in this country. This is what we're doing to ourselves, or being allowed to be done. My question, if I may, is your use of language. I don't mean particularly you, but you have used it tonight. You've said liberal progressive. I tend to say illiberal regressive. And I just wonder if we are... we're using their language, we're allowing ourselves to use their language, we're empowering them. They've taken over the language, which is stifling our freedom of speech, I feel. That's kind of a question.
Thank you. Let's come around this way. I'm just going to take one of the student questions, and then we'll come back to the panel.
You described these activist charities that interact with universities as like the mafia, in that they'll threaten to effectively damage the reputation of the institution by labelling it as racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever. And I completely agree with this description, and it's a huge problem. But I'm going to basically ask a tough question and play devil's advocate here. So I have come across a postdoc in the physics department in Exeter who is female, and not long after she started her postdoc position, she thankfully became pregnant. But the problem, which I don't know whether everyone in the room will understand this with these postdoc contracts, is that they're fixed term and the funding comes from some research council, so there isn't very much control over what you can do with it. So say if you get a 2-year budget, the only choice if someone wanted to go on maternity leave would be to either use up some of the money from that fixed term contract while they were on maternity leave, and then shorten the amount of research that they could do, or they would have to go on maternity leave unpaid, effectively, which in some cases might just leave the person destitute. But the university stepped in this case and said that they would pay her for so many months out of their own pocket as a maternity leave cover. And the reason why they did this was because they wanted to go up a grade on the Athena Swan Award, which is sort of the feminist equivalent of these other charities that have been described earlier. So in this case, I think that this is an example of something where that seems to have motivated the university to do something good, whereas it's also putting these adverse motivations to get involved with teaching and curriculum setting, which seem to have very bad consequences for the teaching. So if you are saying that these organizations are like the mafia, then obviously we want to get rid of them, or at least significantly change how they interact with universities. But what do you think is the solution, and how do you protect the possibly small amount of good work that is done by these organizations?
Okay, thank you. Doug?
Yeah, I mean, So there was a lot of questions there.
Sorry.
On the question about data, ironically, this is the irony. Advanced HU, which runs the Race Equality Charter, we used to. I looked at it the other day. I think they've taken it down, but used to produce really good data. And again, I used a lot of their own data to argue against the kind of the more illiberal, regressive elements that they were putting out in their Race Equality Charter. If you look at, for example, data on staff, I mean, it's about, in terms of per demographic and students, it's an incredibly diverse population across the UK. And so that's a very positive, progressive story. On the point about communism, that's a really good point. I mean, I've said this a couple of times, but I think if you look at the 20th century on a long arc, I mean, it's characterized by two massively totalitarian state projects, industrial state projects, one of which was Nazi Germany, and we rightfully learned in our cultural DNA the horrors of industrialized racism. The other one was communism, but we don't seem to have learned the horrors of the imposition of equality by enlightened bureaucratic elites. And that's why I don't think the West won the Cold War. That's my next book. I want to do that in my next book. Why I don't think the West won the Cold War. Because and the fact that you on campuses you can have really kind of open endorsement of, I mean, look at the horrors of communism. Chairman Mao, in about 6 years in the Cultural Revolution, 45 million people murdered, starved, killed in mass famines. Look at the Gulag system, etc., across the Soviet Union. But we don't seem to have picked that up. I mean, essentially, it was kind of, but that wasn't really communism. It was kind of state capitalism, was other nonsense. So we haven't really sort of. So I think that there is a massive. The gentleman's point in the back, that there is a massive disparity in relation to our cultural DNA. We've learned from Nazi Germany, but we haven't really learned from the horrors of kind of Soviet communism, or communism full stop, and the imposition of equity by enlightened bureaucratic elites. On that point, I mean, of course, there's going to micro. I mean, if a bloke, imagine your postdoc was a bloke and he broke his leg, would they have supported him? I don't know. I mean, just what I mean. So, I mean, it's. I mean, in the book, I think the main thing for me is the illiberal, regressive effects of these charities and how they nudge corporate cultures, and for me, university executive, you go to most university web pages now and they read like something from Momentum with a sort of Momentum meets Extinction Rebellion, and I think to myself, why are you endorsing? These are highly contested ideas, highly contested political ideas. I don't need to know about what the VC thinks or your strategy about this stuff. If academic staff want to research climate change and fight climate change or fight racism or do decolonisation, let 1,000 flowers bloom, as Chairman Mao once said. No problem. But the main thing is when it's imposed by executive fear, and it's a new orthodoxy. And that's the thing that we have to resist. I don't give a toss if you want to study decolonising or Foucault or Derrida or, whatever. But when VCs and provosts across the UK endorse highly contested political ideas and say, you have to do this. So this comes to the other question here, was asked about your question, right? So go direct on this form, the question was about what does it actually say? If I want to put a new course on, as a professor in the Humanities and Social Science faculty, if I want to do a new course, I've got to fill out a form, the independent, the learning outcomes, the indicative reading, etc. There's an edition that was put out about 2 years ago, just after the Race Equality Charter and the George Floyd thing. And it says basically, we're a very diverse university, right? So we've got a very, very diverse student population, and they've come from all over the world. So as a result, right, what we want you to do is, we don't have to do it. So you're not mandated to do it, but it basically says, and direct quote, you have to show how you're moving away from a white Eurocentric curriculum. Now, to me, that's explicitly racist, right? And it's deeply patronising. Well, basically, they've got a box, so I've got no idea. I just leave it blank. But then I'm a tenure. Well, I'm a tenure professor here. If I'm a junior academic or a postdoc, a young and in a much more vulnerable position, right? And I maybe on a 2-year contract, but I want a permanent contract. Then you're damn right I'm going to fill that out. what I'm looking at this. I'm not going to use many white people on my course. I'm going to look at African writers. I have this commitment, and so increasingly now we've gone the American way again, whereby you've got to show how you commit yourself to these equality, diversity, and inclusion. This equality, diversity, inclusion again is an import from corporate America, and it's now ubiquitous across British institutions. And in the university context, it's the apex value now that governs bureaucratic cultures within UK universities, as opposed to freedom. Equality, diversity, inclusion. I mean, in itself, they're kind of bizarre concepts. Diversity should be an outcome of a process, or I mean, it's not a diversity of intellectual opinion. Do you see what I mean? Why don't we make academic freedom? I mean, if universities are some of the sort of the key accelerants of human progress and human knowledge, why don't we make academic freedom our apex value? Do you see what I mean? I mean, so anyway,
Can I just want to come in on that? People have said that they value freedom. In fact, I was recently disinvited by somebody who said that they valued freedom, but that in order for people to be free, they had to feel psychologically safe. And the views of Don't Divide Us made 7 people out of 500 feel psychologically unsafe. I mean, I think that I think we're in slight danger here of bigging up our opponents, because I think what you have to remember is that they are, first of all, they're being invited in. Right, it is universities that are signing up to these charters. Secondly, even if you got rid of all these charities or these charters, would that mean we had a good education system? And I don't think we would, right? Because if we did have a good education system, these people would not be there in the first place, right? They would never have got a foot to toe in. So by focusing too much on what they're doing, and it's easy to do because it's so egregious, it's so explicitly authoritarian. I mean, it's not just the race equality charters, it's the funding organisations. These are government, the government provides funding through the ESR, what's it? And AHRC, the Main Arts and Humanities Funding Council. And if you want to put in any research, if you want to put in a proposal to do some research now, which I did do a few years ago, you do have to show how your research will improve diversity. And the fact is, in the huge fields of human knowledge, not every bit of knowledge is going to have any connection with diversity. So right from the get-go, people whose first commitment should be to free and open thinking, wherever it leads them, are being asked to stultify our own thinking in order to get the money to do the grant, right? So that's not. Well, I think that's not how it works, right? It's not a logical. The point about it is to enforce conformity. It's to make you conform. So if you accept it and then you think, okay, I've accepted, now I'm going to do my own thing. Well, I can assure you it really doesn't work like that. You will find all kinds of ways and people have found this, of being not invited to key meetings, etc., etc. I've had my own academic work scuppered in peer review process, and I only found out because I happened to be on the editorial board, so I could see the email and somebody had forgotten that. So there are all kinds of backhanded ways that people get squeezed out for that. But I think we have to, we can focus. We've got a choice. We can focus on slagging them off and getting them out, which I'm not against. But unless we also think of, well, what do we stand for? Something positive, something constructive. So we have to rebuild the case for the joy, the wonder, the freedom of knowledge, the importance of truth, because somebody asked about free speech. And, if you don't have truth, then what's the point of free speech? Right? The point of freedom of speech, ultimately, is to argue the toss, to persuade, and you become persuasive. The more your claims are generalizable, the more power of persuasion they have, not just through moral stigmatization or shaming, right? So that's the link. That's we have to start, academia has to stand up for its core telos, its intrinsic worth, its intrinsic value, which is the pursuit of truth. And if we can do that, then freedom of speech becomes an easier thing to argue for, because, you know, and that's reclaim our disciplines and reclaim the joy and freedom of knowledge, I'd say.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple more before we wrap up. I wondered if we could move away from the university a little bit and just to try and work out, well, how far does this now reach, and how on earth has this gone outside of the university to, why is it that everybody knew what decolonisation was? When we discussed planning this discussion, I said to Alka, can we avoid any isations, ologies and isms? And it's very, very difficult to do that. But the weird thing is that everybody's talking about these kinds of concepts now.
We've had a so-called Conservative government for over a decade now. Why do you think they have not tackled the whole idea of disinviting, deplatforming, not only in education, but also in local authorities and places like that where, I'm going to use the N-word, where Marxism basically has moved in to try and stifle the freedom of speech? Surely they've had over 10 years to do this.
Thank you. Thanks. Yep.
Several months ago, a few national papers commented on the fact that about 40 UK universities are funded directly by the Chinese government through various grant schemes. At which point does this industrial scale brainwashing of the young becomes a national security threat? And is this just a result of incompetence, or is something more nefarious going on?
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. It's all very slick, isn't it?
Born and raised in the Exeter area. The chap that just asked the question then, and it was mentioned up on the stage briefly, although I don't trust and dislike all politicians, I think the Tories inherited the wave of wokeness that this is all part of, and we're battling against. I like the idea that we've been fed this word progressive, which means things are going backwards. I think that was a good point. I'd just like to mention one previous event that Jack Dee, the comedian. I think we can learn a lot about comedy and the comedians. We're talking about the whole, not just universities, but Jack Dee did one of these things online, and he talked about the fear that comedians have now in appearing at universities, because they're fed like the list, like you talk about, of what they can say, what they can't say. Comedy is meant to push the boundaries, and the disease of wokeness, I think, is tested to the limits there. And I hope the universities are fighting back against that. I'd love to hear the other side of that. But if comedians are shying away from the universities, I think that's very, very sad, very worrying. Thank you.
Thank you. Funnily enough, that's the first time anybody's mentioned woke, isn't that? That's very strange, isn't it? No, I know.
Oh, thank you. You asked some questions sort of outside the campus. They're trying to introduce wokeness or diversity, equity, inclusion into my profession, which is basically a highly mathematical one. So it's really a load of nonsense. Everyone is getting stuffed with this stuff nowadays, and once you analyse it, you realise it's really a load of nonsense. I produced a diversity dartboard to show that all these concepts are really defined by the methods of promoting them. That's all they are. There's nothing inside. So what can you say?
Great, thank you. Any final question? Oh, very good.
Just a question for Doug about have you had the effect really on campus about you speaking out? I'm just thinking of other professors that I know about, like Professor Kathleen Stock, who was hounded out of her job, and Professor Selina Todd, who I believe still works at Oxford, but she needed security for a term when she was teaching because she attended a Women's Place UK meeting. So I just wanted to know if you've had any negative effects, or maybe not because you're male.
So there's a lot there, right? Number one, I go to the last question. I worked on the Academic Freedom Bill, and that's a ray of light, I guess. I have had effects. I can't talk about them. But I have a lot. But what I would say is this. I completely agree with your point about the gender-critical feminists. They have been at the sharp end. And it's definitely, a lot of the abuse you see is definitely gendered. And I work closely with Selena on other stuff. And I know Kathleen personally as well. And so the stuff that they've got is 100 times worse than what I've had. And so there's definitely a gender angle to this. So I'll put that on the table, number one. There's a gentleman here with a tie on asked about the Tories, right? So, good question, right? The last 3 months of the Blair government passed what was called the Equality Act. Sounds nice, doesn't it? Equality, you could be against equality. That's nice. Now, what does it actually do? Part of the Equality Act has what's called the Public Sector Equality Duty, and in that is Section 149. That mandates that all public sector bodies have to basically create equality between people of protected characteristics, race, gender, sexuality, disability, etc. Right? So what that Equality Act has effectively done is it's provided the legal basis for most of what we call woke or intersectional ideology across public institutions, basically. HR departments and EDI inquisitors and sort of bureaucrats have used spurious interpretations of the Equality Act to push through this stuff across British institutions. Section 149. And what's the major measure of equality? And going back to the gentleman's question about communism, equality is measured, and it says in the Equality Act, equality of opportunity, but how do you measure it? Equality of outcomes. So basically, if somebody has a differential outcome, a negative differential outcome, is proof inequality, therefore we have to change institutional cultures to make sure that little Johnny A gets what little Johnny B's got, basically, right? So the Tories, this is a frustration of mine, you're going to pick this up. Tories go on about culture war all the time, right? What it really is, I've worked closely with ministers and various governments, and I know a lot of the people at the heart of this, I know them personally, right? So I can speak from some degree of experience. What they're really about, they don't want to go near the Equality Act because it's called the Equality Act. We don't want to be the nasty party. That's why they won't go for the Equality Act. So what they do instead, Kemi as well, Kemi and Suella, they chase headlines. They come out and they chase headlines. It's kind of woke whack-a-mole in the Daily Mail and Daily Telegraph because it plays well with the Tory party base. If the Conservatives come back, I've always said this for a long time, the major red line that they've got to draw, if they ever come back into power, is they've got to reform or abolish the Equality Act, reform it into another, and some anti-discrimination law, but reboot that because it's the Equality Act that's been the legal value nexus that Stonewall, Advance HE, and these other illiberal, regressive organisations have used to push their snake oil on across British institutional life. Second point, a lot of this stuff is really because we're cowards. There's a lot of cowards out there that won't stand up, basically. It doesn't take that much. It doesn't take that much. So my frustration with the Tory party, all this culture war nonsense, from day one, if they had half a strategic brain, they should have got rid of or majorly reformed the Equality Act, because that is the legal foundation stone upon which most of what we call woke is being driven across British institutional life. Get rid of it from day one, the next administration. That's what has to happen. And was another point.
Just following on from that, I mean, I talk to a lot of teachers and heads, and this is all happening in schools, by the way. I'm not saying this is happening in every single school that, and it's not like every single teacher is an activist. But what you do have is the utter implosion of any idea that schools should be about education, right? Mostly they will be about exam results and or making kids fit for society, getting them society ready. And what is society? Well, society is full of all this homophobia, blah, 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 all these horrible negative things. So we have to inoculate them against these social, malfeasances and horrible things out there. And, maybe there's, education at school level has always had an element of socialisation in it. That's been part of it. But that has traditionally been, you socialise kids indirectly through an education to accept wider kind of sets of social norms that already exist in society. That is kind of what Durkheim meant when he was talking about socialisation at the beginning of the 20th century, when you had a stronger consensus than you have today. Today, when there is very very weak consensus about what is important. You go to a library, go to a kid's toddler's reading library. This has happened with my kids about 20 years ago, and you look around, the kids are scrambling all over the place, creating merry hell, and the adults, myself included, are looking at each other thinking, are they misbehaving or are they just being playful? Is it? Should we do something? Are you going to say something? And there's this kind of we're just sort of living in a culture that undermines our authority to say or do anything, makes us double check everything. So it's hard to be spontaneously responsive to everyday situations, and that's really important because that is really intimately linked to moral deliberation. Right? Moral deliberation is not linked to intellectual or academic thinking. It's actually closer linked to feelings and subjectivity. So if our subjectivity is being curtailed in these informal ways, then our moral thinking is being curtailed and we have a lack of courage. This is happening in schools. It's happening mainly through our second report. It's on our website at Don't Divide Us. The rise of third-party organisations. Nobody has any scrutiny over them. The DFE doesn't know what they're doing. They are accountable to nobody. They are being invited in by hapless heads who are not activists themselves, but they feel they want to make their pupils ready for society, and this seems to be the way to do it because nobody else is telling them anything else. And they're coming in, and if you saw the school that tried to end racism, that Channel 4 programme that I think was the depth of obscenity, I think, where you see academics gloating over making kids cry about their skin colour. This is not just nonsense. This stuff is cruel. It's cruel to kids, and we've seen the effects of it recently on our streets when a lot of young people think a pogrom is a sign of resistance. Right? So it can actually lead to physical violence. We don't have to look too far back in history to know that. So it is an enormous problem we're facing. It's not just a problem. This is a problem of political authority that cuts across all the parties. It's been there throughout the 20th century, and there have been these various holding strategies, but they're going. And the chickens are coming home to roost, as you said, and we've got to get our act together on this. We have to recognise the problem, and we have to just call it out. And it doesn't need a grand strategy. All it needs is just people to say, I disagree. I don't want to do that. You can do it. You'll be surprised what happens.
Yeah, thanks. So if you look around the room, I think there is, I don't remember conversations like the ones we've been having for the last 3 to 4 years, ever having happened before, where people really are trying to understand cultural shifts that used to be understood as just really subtle. People used to talk about political correctness and some of these things that we weren't very comfortable about, but they've become very explicit now, and people like you are trying to help us understand them in order to challenge them. So I'm relatively confident that we can push back really hard on this kind of stuff. I just wondered, just for final comments from both of you, really quickly, because I know people want to get to the bar. What things what's the one thing that makes you most kind of optimistic that where you can succeed in pushing back?
Well, I'm naturally a very optimistic person, but I say this COVID has really mangled me up a little bit. So maybe I've come across as a bit too negative today, so my apologies for that. But what I would say is this. I think that the academic freedom bill is an important thing, and I worked on that. There was about 8 of us worked on that, and we worked with the DFE on that. So that was quite good. That's done, and that essentially basically it creates a new directorate in the OFS, another bureaucracy, but it is what it is. And you have a new academic freedom director, a guy called Arif Ahmed, who I know personally is a great guy, former academic at Cambridge, and he's the director of that. And that comes into force in 2024. And I think that would be helpful in the university context as well. But what I'd also say is I think going forward, I think the new dispensation in British politics really should be about taking back control. And really is. We have these concentrated centres of unaccountable power in this country, most of which you pay for, by the way. All these people that have been brought into schools, who's paying for them? You are. Basically, they're all taxpayer funded. So we need a much stronger cognizance about where the money is coming from that is then being used to poison young minds or to decolonise the campuses. We're paying for this. You have concentrated, we're not even disciplined by the market, so the media market, like the BBC. The stuff that comes out, I mean, the gentleman at the back talked about this, the stuff that's coming out of these. So we need a democratic revolution, I think, in this country, basically, where our money is being used to fund a load of people in NGOs and charities and Quangos in particular. The Quango system is there's a whole nother chat. I'll come back in a couple. You know, we're talking about hundreds of billions of your money paying for this, right? And even like talking about ministers, they don't even control most of it. NHS England, right? Who's ever heard of NHS England? So anyway, cut a long story short, we need a democratic revolution, and we need to take back control.
What makes me optimistic? You, all of you. See, reality. And the reality is that there are actually more of us, and I include myself with you, despite my brown skin, because I'm a human being more than before I am a brown person. And I think reality, just looking at the world of knowledge, when you see the fantastic knowledge and art that there is here that is being ignored, the potential that has for people who are interested in that to really make an amazing education system, one that could really be qualitatively different for a different age. We're not there yet, but we are the resources of that. If we can't be excited and trust ourselves, and there's nobody else, people from Mars aren't going to come down and save us. So, yeah, a democratic revolution, but just let's remember we are the demos.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, let's thank our speakers. Well, you can all pile onto the bar now. The poor two bar staff are going to be overwhelmed. We've got this place until 9:45, so do hang around and chat to each other. If anybody does want to try and get any kind of group going here, come and gather around me, and then I can make sure you meet each other. And go and buy Doug's book, which is on sale at the back, $14.99, which is very, very good value, especially for an academic book, which is extremely good value for an academic book, and it's a really excellent read. You can give it as a Christmas present, or you can read it yourself, and Doug will sign it for you, I'm sure. And also, we are selling our Free Speech Union tote bags, which are the perfect receptacle for Doug's book, but also the perfect Secret Santa present. So if you're obliged to buy a Secret Santa present for anybody, you've got a choice of two quotes, Lord Justice Sedley and John Milton, £10 each, and they're beautiful quality. And then finally, if you would like to join the Free Speech Union, you're not yet a member, come and talk to me about it, because we can sign you up tonight. So just come and talk to me, and we can get that sorted and remedy that situation. So thanks for coming, and we look forward to chatting to you in the next hour. Thank you.